Story number 1. The bus to nowhere. I still can't explain what happened that night. I've told the story 1,000 times. But no one believes me. They say I must have been hallucinating or overtired. But I know what I saw, what I felt, and every Christmas Eve, I feel that cold dread creeping back, reminding me it was all real. It started on December 24th, 1978. In Mexico City, the streets were unusually quiet for a holiday. The city had been blanketed in a strange, oppressive fog, and most people had already retreated to their homes for the night. But I had to get across town. My mother was waiting for me, and I had promised her I wouldn't be late. I was standing at the corner of Insurgentes Avenue, shivering slightly in the cool night air. The usual noise of the city was muted, replaced by the occasional hum of a distant engine or the faint echo of laughter from a nearby building. I checked my watch, 10:30 p.m. The bus was late. When I saw the headlights cutting through the fog, I felt an immense wave of relief. A weathered, old bus with faded paint and cracked windows pulled up to the curb. The doors creaked open, and I climbed aboard, brushing off the eerie sensation that something was off. The driver barely glanced at me as I paid my fare. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, and he wore a coat that looked several sizes too big. I mumbled a gracias and moved toward the back. The air inside the bus was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. The first thing I noticed was the passengers, or what I thought were passengers. There were about 10 of them, scattered throughout the bus, each wrapped in old, tattered clothing. No one looked up as I passed. They all sat rigidly, staring straight ahead. Their skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, God, their eyes, empty, lifeless. I shook off the unease that was bubbling up in my chest and took a seat near the middle, clutching my bag tightly in my lap. The bus groaned to life, and we began to move. At first, I tried to ignore the strangeness. Maybe the other passengers were just exhausted or lost in their thoughts. Maybe the dim, flickering light inside the bus was playing tricks on my mind. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The bus didn't stop. We passed stop after stop, each one marked by faint pools of light illuminating empty benches. No one got on. No one got off. I leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, but his face was obscured. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The road outside grew darker, the streetlights fading into the distance. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I addressed the nearest passenger, a woman with stringy black hair that hung limply around her face. "Do you know when we'll reach the next stop?" She didn't respond. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and the moment my fingers brushed against her coat, she turned her head slowly, her eyes locked onto mine, and my breath caught in my throat. Her pupils were milky white, her skin mottled with patches of gray and blue. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no sound came out, only a low, guttural rasp. I yanked my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey!" I shouted, rising to my feet. "What's going on here? Driver, stop the bus." The driver didn't react. The other passengers remained motionless, their eerie stillness suffocating. I stumbled toward the front of the bus, gripping the seats for balance as the vehicle swayed and jolted. "Let me off!" I screamed. The driver finally turned his head, and my blood ran cold. His face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes, oh, God, his eyes were the same as hers, empty, hollow. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he said, his voice low and rasping, like the whisper of dry leaves in the wind. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I bolted toward the rear doors, slamming my fists against the glass. "Let me out! Let me out!" The bus groaned to a halt, and the doors creaked open. I didn't hesitate. I leapt out into the darkness, tumbling onto the cold, hard ground. When I looked back, the bus was already pulling away, its taillights vanishing into the fog. The sound of its engine faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. The next morning, I told my story to anyone who would listen. Most people dismissed it as a bad dream or a figment of my imagination. But an old man at the market pulled me aside, his face grave. "You said it was bus 666? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "That route hasn't run in years," he said. "There was an accident, a robbery gone wrong. They say the driver and all the passengers were killed. Some say the bus still runs, looking for lost souls to join them." I never took another bus after that. And every Christmas Eve, when the fog rolls in and the streets grow quiet, I think of that night. I think of the hollow eyes and the lifeless faces, of the driver's chilling words, and I pray that I never see those headlights again. Story number 2. The silent bus. I didn't think twice when I saw the headlights piercing through the icy darkness. Alaska winters have a way of making even the most familiar places feel alien. And that night in 1993, I was stranded on a lonely road outside of Anchorage. The snow was falling in thick, suffocating sheets, and the cold gnawed at my face despite the scarf wrapped tightly around it. So when the bus pulled up, I felt a flicker of relief. The vehicle looked old, its paint faded and streaked with grime, but it was warm, moving, and most importantly, heading toward town. I raised a hand, and the bus groaned to a stop. Its doors hissed open, spilling a blast of warm, stale air into the freezing night. "Thanks," I muttered, stepping aboard and fumbling in my pocket for change. The driver didn't respond. He simply nodded, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap, and gestured for me to take a seat. I didn't think much of it, after all. It was late, and everyone in Alaska has their own way of coping with the endless, punishing winter nights. I shuffled toward the back, the bus rocking gently beneath me. The interior was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering faintly, casting long shadows that danced across the seats. At first glance, the bus seemed nearly full, with passengers scattered throughout, bundled in heavy coats and hats. But something felt off. The passengers were too still. They sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, their faces pale and expressionless. Not one of them spoke. Not one turned to glance at me as I passed. Even the sound of my boots against the metal floor seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I found an empty seat near the back and sank into it, pulling my coat tighter around me. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and something faintly metallic. The bus groaned back into motion, its wheels crunching over the snow-covered road. Outside, the world was a blur of white and shadow. I stared out the window, watching the skeletal outlines of trees whip past, their branches weighed down by snow. I tried to shake the unease that had settled over me, telling myself that the silence was normal. It was late. People were tired. They probably just wanted to get home and out of the cold. But then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. No one got off. The bus passed stop after stop, each one marked by a faint glow from the streetlights. But not a single passenger moved. No one rang the bell or shuffled toward the doors. The bus didn't even slow down. It just kept going, its headlights carving through the storm. I glanced at the driver. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against the cracked leather gloves he wore. His face remained turned away, the brim of his cap low over his eyes. I thought about calling out to him, asking if we were on the right route. But something stopped me. The other passengers. Their stillness was unnerving, their silence suffocating. I glanced at the person sitting across the aisle from me. A woman in a long coat and a knit hat pulled low over her ears. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her head bowed slightly. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't react. "Ma'am." "Nothing." I leaned closer, my heart thudding against my ribs. The dim light from the overhead bulb caught her face, and I recoiled. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her lips were tinged with a bluish hue. Frost clung to her eyelashes and the edges of her hat. She wasn't breathing. I turned away, my pulse racing. My eyes darted to the other passengers, and the truth slammed into me like a freight train. None of them were breathing. I shot to my feet, gripping the back of the seat for balance as the bus swayed around a curve. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, fogging the air around me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Driver!" The man didn't respond. He just kept driving, his shoulders hunched over the wheel. I stumbled toward the front of the bus, my boots slipping on the damp floor. The silence pressed against me, heavier than the storm outside. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The driver finally turned his head, and my blood ran cold. His face was skeletal, his hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. His grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "You're not supposed to be here," he rasped, his voice like the whisper of wind through dead trees. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and bolted toward the rear doors, my heart hammering in my chest. The other passengers remained motionless, their lifeless eyes staring straight ahead. The doors wouldn't budge. "Let me out," I screamed, pounding on the glass. "Stop the bus." The driver let out a low, chilling laugh. "You shouldn't have gotten on." The bus lurched to a stop so abruptly that I was thrown against the doors. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling with the handle until it finally gave way. The frigid air hit me like a wall as I stumbled out into the snow. I turned back just in time to see the bus pull away, its taillights vanishing into the swirling white storm. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for what felt like hours, my breath freezing in the air. When I finally made it back to town the next morning, I told my story to anyone who would listen. Most people dismissed it as the ramblings of a man exhausted by the cold and the storm. But one old-timer at the diner nodded grimly when I mentioned the bus. "They say Route 13 went off the road in a blizzard years ago," he said, his voice low. "Driver lost control, and everyone on board froze before help could reach them." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sometimes," he added, his eyes narrowing, "that bus still runs its route, picking up unlucky souls who don't know any better. I haven't taken a bus since." Story number 3. The Boy on the Bus. It was Christmas Eve, 2002, and the wind howled through the dark streets of a small Scottish town. The cold crept into every crevice, biting at exposed skin and frosting the edges of windows. I had been driving the night bus for years, and while I was used to the eerie stillness of the late shift, something about that night felt different. The streets were emptier than usual, and the silence was so profound it seemed to press against the bus like a living thing. It was just after 11 p.m. when I saw him. I was approaching a stop near the outskirts of town, a lonely place surrounded by barren fields and skeletal trees. There, under the flickering light of a solitary street lamp, stood a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his small frame wrapped in a threadbare coat. Snowflakes dusted his dark hair, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. I slowed the bus and opened the door, the icy wind rushing in as I leaned out. "Where are you headed, lad?" I asked, my breath clouding in the freezing air. He didn't answer. Without a word, he climbed aboard, his boots squeaking softly against the floor. His silence unsettled me, but I told myself he was probably shy or cold. I watched him make his way to the back of the bus, his small figure swallowed by the shadows. He sat by the window, staring out into the snowy darkness. The boy's presence weighed heavily on me as I continued the route. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't so much as glance my way. I checked the rearview mirror periodically, but all I could see was the faint outline of his figure against the frosted window. At the next stop, I called out to him. "This is Town Square. You getting off here?" Nothing. He didn't even turn his head. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crawled down my spine. I told myself he was probably just tired, or maybe he was lost and too embarrassed to admit it. Either way, I couldn't leave him out here in the freezing cold. So I decided to let him ride until the end of the line. As the bus rumbled through the town, the uneasy feeling grew. The streets were utterly deserted, and the snow fell heavier, blanketing everything in a suffocating silence. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me, though I was alone save for the boy. At one point, I tried again to engage him. I parked at a stop and walked down the aisle, my boots echoing against the metal floor. "Hey, kid," I said, keeping my tone light. "You need help getting home?" He didn't respond. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The seat around him was wet, the fabric dark and glistening. It wasn't just damp, it was soaked, as if he had been sitting in a puddle of melted snow. Yet his clothes were dry. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. The boy finally turned his head, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, oh, God, his eyes were empty, not blind, not milky or clouded, but utterly devoid of life, like the cold void of the snow-covered fields outside. I stumbled backward, gripping the seats for balance. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a chilling expression that seemed to freeze the air around him. And then, just as I blinked, he was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty seat. The puddle remained, glistening eerily in the dim light. My hands shook as I backed away, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The bus was silent again, but the silence was different now, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I hurried back to the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor me to reality. The bus felt colder now, the frost creeping along the edges of the windows like ghostly fingers. I drove mechanically, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When I reached the depot at the end of the line, I was met by my supervisor, a gruff man named Duncan. He frowned as he saw me stumble off the bus, pale and trembling. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "There was a boy," I began, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "He got on near the fields, but he disappeared. And the seat." Duncan's face darkened, and he held up a hand to stop me. "Did you say near the fields?" I nodded, confusion and fear twisting in my gut. He sighed heavily and motioned for me to follow him inside. In the break room, over a cup of hot tea that did little to calm my nerves, Duncan told me the story. Years ago, a young boy had gone missing on Christmas Eve while playing near the fields. He had wandered too far and gotten caught in a sudden snowstorm. By the time they found him, he was frozen solid, his small body buried beneath a layer of snow. His family never recovered from the tragedy, and the townsfolk had whispered about his ghost ever since. "They say he appears to travelers sometimes," Duncan said, his voice low. "Always on Christmas Eve, always near the fields. You're not the first to see him." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what I just heard. The boy's pale face, his empty eyes, the chilling smile, they all came rushing back, vivid and haunting. "Did anyone ever try to help him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Duncan shook his head. "There's no helping him. He's just lost." That night, I lay awake. The boy's image burned into my mind. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, wandering the snowy fields, searching for something or someone. And every Christmas Eve since, as the snow falls and the wind howls, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a small figure standing under the flickering glow of a street lamp, waiting for a ride that will never take him home. Story number 4. The laughs on the last bus. It was Christmas Eve, 1980, and the streets of Toronto were dusted with a fresh layer of snow. As a bus driver, I'd grown accustomed to the quiet loneliness of late-night shifts during the holidays. Most people were home with their families, and the few passengers I picked up were often headed to their own small gatherings. That night was no different, or so I thought. I was driving Route 17, the last run of the night, and the city was unusually serene. The streetlights cast soft glows on the snowy sidewalks, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional crunch of snow beneath passing tires. My bus was empty, as it often was at this hour, and I settled into the rhythm of the quiet drive. It wasn't until I reached one of the final stops, near a stretch of old residential homes, that I saw them. A group of 6 or 7 people standing at the curb. They were dressed for a party, bright dresses, tuxedos, and jackets that seemed out of place in the frigid air. The sight of them caught me off guard, but I pulled the bus to a stop and opened the doors. "Evening," I said, offering a friendly nod. The first man stepped aboard, his polished shoes clicking against the metal floor. He was tall, with slicked back hair and a charming grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening, driver," he replied, his voice warm yet distant. The others followed, chatting and laughing amongst themselves as they filed to the back of the bus. I caught snippets of their conversation, something about a party, drinks, and someone's awful dancing. Their laughter was infectious, and for the first time that night, I felt a spark of holiday cheer. As I continued driving, their voices grew louder, filling the empty bus with life. I glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, catching glimpses of their animated gestures and bright smiles. They seemed like the kind of people who lit up a room just by entering it, the kind of people you couldn't help but envy for their carefree spirit. But as the miles ticked by, I noticed something strange. Despite the biting cold outside, the bus was growing warmer. The windows began to fog, and I could feel beads of sweat forming under my cap. I adjusted the heater, thinking it must have been set too high, but the warmth persisted. Then came the laughter. First, it was faint, blending with their lively chatter, but as we drove further, it became sharper, louder, almost manic, the kind of laughter that prickles the back of your neck and makes your skin crawl. I glanced in the mirror again, and for a moment, it looked as though they were all staring at me. Their faces were illuminated by the dim overhead lights, and their eyes, too bright, too wide, seemed to follow my every move. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. It was late, after all, and I was ready for this shift to end. As we neared the final stop, the laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I glanced in the mirror again, but this time, I couldn't see them. The back of the bus was shrouded in shadows, the fogged windows obscuring any detail. "Last stop," I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No one responded. My heart began to race as I pulled the bus to a halt. I turned in my seat, expecting to see them still gathered at the back, perhaps too drunk or too engrossed in conversation to notice we'd arrived. But the bus was empty. My pulse quickened as I stood and walked down the aisle, peering into each row of seats. There was no sign of the group, no coats draped over seats, no lingering perfume or cologne. The air was cold again, biting and sterile, as if no one had been there at all. I stepped off the bus, scanning the snow-covered street. It was deserted, with no footprints leading away from the stop. The only marks in the snow were the tire tracks from my own bus. A chill ran down my spine as I climbed back aboard, shutting the doors with trembling hands. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning, expecting to be laughed at or dismissed. Instead, his face grew pale, and he leaned forward in his chair. "You said they got on near Birchwood Street?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah. Why?" He hesitated before speaking, his words slow and deliberate. "A few years back, a group of young people died in a car accident on Christmas Eve. They were heading home from a party near Birchwood Street." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "What are you saying?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "You're not the first driver to see them." I didn't know what to say. The thought of it, a group of spirits reliving their final moments, trapped in an endless loop of revelry and tragedy, made my stomach turn. I finished the rest of my shifts that week in a haze, avoiding Route 17 whenever I could. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it every Christmas Eve. I can still hear their laughter, echoing through the empty bus. Sometimes, when I drive past Birchwood Street, I swear I see them standing at the curb, waiting for a ride that never truly ends. And every time, I pray that no one stops to pick them up. Story number 5. The Vanishing of Bus 375. It was the coldest Christmas Eve in Beijing's memory. 1995. The kind of bone-deep chill that crawls under your skin no matter how many layers you wear. I had worked late at the restaurant and missed the earlier buses. By the time I reached the bus stop near the Summer Palace, it was well past midnight. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath my boots. The schedule at the stop showed one final bus for the night, Route 375. It would take me most of the way home. I shivered in the biting wind and hugged my coat closer, praying the bus wouldn't be delayed. As if on cue, headlights pierced through the foggy night. The bus emerged from the darkness like a ghostly silhouette, its windows fogged from the cold. I climbed aboard, dropping a few coins into the fare box, and looked around. There were only a few passengers, scattered across the dimly lit interior. I took a seat near the back, next to a window streaked with frost. The atmosphere was somber. No one spoke, and the hum of the engine was the only sound. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, kept his eyes fixed on the road. Next to him sat the ticket collector, a woman wrapped in a heavy scarf, her face barely visible. The bus made its first few stops without incident. A few more passengers boarded, their breaths visible in the freezing air. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. Something about the bus felt wrong. It happened as we approached the outskirts of the city. The road stretched long and desolate, flanked by barren trees and the occasional flickering street lamp. The next stop was empty until two figures emerged from the shadows. They were men, tall and thin, dressed in long, flowing robes that seemed out of place for the modern streets of Beijing. Their faces were obscured by their low hoods, and they moved with an unnatural grace. A chill ran down my spine as they boarded the bus. The ticket collector hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the two men. She asked for their fare, and one of them reached into his robe, pulling out a handful of old, tarnished coins. They jingled as he dropped them into her hand. The two men took seats near the front, their heads bowed, their faces hidden. The air in the bus seemed to grow colder. I noticed the other passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said a word. We continued on, the bus rattling through the empty streets. The ticket collector began her rounds, checking tickets and making small talk. When she reached the two men, she hesitated again. Something about them clearly unsettled her. She said something in a low voice, but I couldn't make it out over the hum of the engine. One of the men looked up. For the first time, I saw his face, or rather, what should have been his face. It was blank, featureless, like a mask of pale flesh stretched over a skull. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The ticket collector staggered back, her eyes wide with terror. The man's hood fell away, revealing more of his grotesque, inhuman features. The second man turned as well, his face identical to the first. A collective gasp rose from the passengers, followed by a panicked murmur. The driver slammed on the brakes, the bus screeching to a halt. "Get off my bus," he shouted, his voice trembling. The two men didn't move. Instead, they turned their heads in unison, their eyeless faces scanning the rest of us. Panic erupted. Passengers scrambled for the doors, pushing and shoving in their desperation to escape. I was frozen in place, my mind racing, my body paralyzed by fear. The lights in the bus flickered, then went out entirely. In the pitch-black darkness, the only sounds were the ragged breaths of the passengers and the low, guttural whispers of the two men. It sounded like they were chanting, their voices deep and otherworldly. When the lights came back on, the two men were gone, but so was the driver. The bus began to move, its engine roaring to life without anyone at the wheel. The ticket collector screamed, banging on the glass partition separating her from the driver's seat. "Stop the bus!" she yelled. But it was no use. The bus careened down the icy road, faster and faster, as if possessed by some malevolent force. I clung to my seat, my knuckles white as I braced for impact. The bus veered sharply, throwing passengers against the walls. One by one, the lights flickered out again, plunging us into darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with a sense of dread so palpable it felt like a weight on my chest. When the bus finally came to a stop, everything went silent. The doors hissed open, revealing a vast expanse of snow-covered emptiness. We were nowhere near the city. The landscape was barren, lit only by the pale glow of the moon. The ticket collector stepped off first, calling out into the void. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice echoed, but there was no response. One by one, the passengers followed, too terrified to stay on the bus. I was the last to leave, my legs shaking as I stepped onto the frozen ground. The bus's headlights dimmed, then went out entirely, leaving us in near-total darkness. I turned to look back, but the bus was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. The next morning, authorities found the bus abandoned in a remote field. Inside, every passenger, including the driver, was frozen solid, their faces contorted in expressions of terror. The bodies were so cold they shattered like glass when touched. To this day, no one knows what happened to Bus 375 that night. Some say it was cursed. Others believe it was a portal to another realm. All I know is that I was there, and I'll never forget the sight of those eyeless faces staring back at me. Not all passengers are meant to reach their destination. Story number 6. The Silent Bus Ride. It was Christmas Eve, 1957, and New York City was unusually quiet. The snow had started falling earlier that evening, blanketing the city in a hush that muted even the honks and rumbles of the ever-bustling streets. I had been at work later than expected, finishing up some last-minute paperwork at the law office where I just started. By the time I left, the streets were nearly deserted. I hurried to the bus stop, my heels clicking against the icy pavement. The cold bit through my wool coat, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. When I finally reached the stop, the only sound was the gentle hum of a street lamp above me. No one else was waiting, and for a fleeting moment, I considered walking the 20 blocks home. Then I heard it, the low growl of an engine, growing louder as it approached through the falling snow. The bus came into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was one of the older models, with its worn-out paint and dim interior lights. I waved it down, relieved that I wouldn't have to trudge through the snow after all. The doors groaned open, and I stepped aboard. The driver didn't greet me, which struck me as odd. Bus drivers in New York weren't known for their cheerfulness, but they usually gave a nod or a grunt. This one stared straight ahead, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his cap. I shrugged it off and moved down the aisle, dropping my coins into the fare box. The bus was nearly full, but the passengers sat eerily still, their heads bowed as if in silent prayer. I found an empty seat near the middle and settled in, grateful for the warmth of the heater. The ride was quiet, too quiet. No one was talking, not even the teenagers I usually saw laughing and joking on the late-night buses. I glanced around, my unease growing. The passengers were oddly pale, their skin almost translucent in the dim light. They all seemed to be staring at their laps or out the windows, avoiding eye contact with one another. The bus lurched forward, its old engine groaning with the effort. I tried to shake off the strange atmosphere, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd had a long day, and the cold had probably left me on edge. But then, the man sitting next to me turned his head. At first, I thought he was about to speak. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if it took a great effort just to look my way. But when his face came into view, my breath caught in my throat. His eyes, no. The place where his eyes should have been were hollow, smooth, pale skin stretched over empty sockets, and his mouth hung open slightly, as if he were trying to form words but couldn't. I froze, unable to look away. He tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile that was anything but comforting. "Get off," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the bus. "Get off now." My heart was pounding as I scrambled to my feet, clutching my bag tightly. No one else on the bus seemed to notice what had just happened. The other passengers remained still, their heads bowed, their hands resting limply on their laps. I stumbled toward the front of the bus, gripping the poles for balance as the vehicle swayed through the snow-covered streets. The driver didn't react as I approached, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Stop the bus," I shouted, my voice breaking the heavy silence. Without a word, he pulled over, the doors creaking open to let in the icy wind. I didn't wait for the bus to come to a complete stop. I leapt off and landed awkwardly on the snow-covered sidewalk, nearly losing my balance. The bus didn't wait. It rumbled back onto the street and disappeared into the darkness, its taillights fading like the embers of a dying fire. I stood there, my breath clouding the air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was in an unfamiliar part of the city, the buildings looming tall and silent around me. There were no other pedestrians, no passing cars, just the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots as I started walking. My mind raced with questions. Had I imagined it? Was I so exhausted that my mind had played tricks on me? Then I saw the sign. It was an old wooden plaque, half buried in the snow, marking the corner of the street. The faded letters read, "Accident Site, December 24th, 1956. Beneath it, a smaller line of text caught my eye, "In memory of those lost in the 23rd Street bus tragedy." My stomach dropped. I had heard about the accident in passing. A bus skidded off an icy bridge last Christmas Eve, plunging into the freezing river below. All passengers, including the driver, had perished. The story had been on the front page of every newspaper for weeks, but I hadn't paid much attention at the time. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. The bus I had just been on, it couldn't have been real. The passengers, the driver, they weren't alive. They couldn't be. I turned to look back down the street, half expecting to see the bus idling in the distance, waiting for me to return. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the falling snow. I never spoke about that night to anyone. I couldn't bring myself to. Who would believe me? But every Christmas Eve, I think about the man with no eyes, the driver who never looked at me, and the silent passengers who seemed trapped in an endless journey. And I wonder if they're still out there, roaming the streets of New York, searching for someone to join them on their ghostly ride. Story number 7. The Ghost Bus of Cambridge Gardens. It was Christmas Eve in London, 1935. The city was cloaked in a thin veil of fog, the kind that muffled sound and blurred shapes until the familiar became strange. I was walking home after a long shift at the factory, my breath visible in the freezing air. The streets were eerily quiet, with most people tucked away in their warm homes, celebrating the holiday. I had missed the last tram and decided to wait for the night bus at the stop near Cambridge Gardens. It was a quiet corner of the city, a little too far from the bustling center. The gas lamps cast dim halos of light, barely penetrating the fog that seemed to thicken by the second. I stood there for what felt like hours, pacing to keep warm. The streets were deserted, and the only sound was the faint whistle of the wind. Just as I was beginning to think I'd have to walk the rest of the way, I saw headlights cutting through the fog. Relief washed over me as the bus appeared, its bulky shape emerging from the haze like a ship through rough seas. But something was off. The bus was moving too fast for a residential street, its engine roaring like a freight train. I stepped closer to the curb, raising my hand to signal the driver to stop. As it drew nearer, my stomach tightened. The bus wasn't slowing down. In fact, it seemed to be accelerating. The headlights grew brighter, almost blinding, and I could feel the vibration of its engine in the ground beneath my feet. I stepped back, waving frantically. It wasn't until the bus was almost upon me that I realized there was no driver. I froze, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The driver's seat was empty, the wheel turning on its own as the vehicle barreled down the street. The interior lights flickered, revealing rows of empty seats that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. I jumped back just in time. The bus roared past me, its massive frame missing me by mere inches. The wind it created knocked me off balance, and I stumbled to the ground, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The bus didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. Instead, it vanished into the fog as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of its engine behind. I sat there on the pavement, struggling to catch my breath. Had I imagined it? The fog, the cold, and my exhaustion, it could all have been a trick of the mind. But when I looked down, I saw the proof. Long dark skid marks streaked the road, fresh and undeniable. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the empty bus haunted me, its phantom headlights blazing in my memory every time I closed my eyes. The next morning, I told a colleague about what I'd seen. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, his face went pale, and he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've seen the ghost bus," he said. The story was well known among the locals, though I had never heard it before. Years ago, on Christmas Eve, a driver had lost control of his bus on that very stretch of road. The vehicle had swerved wildly before crashing into the nearby embankment, killing everyone on board. Witnesses claimed the driver had been speeding, but the man's family insisted he had been a careful and responsible worker. Ever since that tragic night, there had been rumors of a phantom bus haunting the streets near Cambridge Gardens. It appeared only on foggy nights, always around Christmas, and always without a driver or passengers. I tried to brush it off as a tall tale, a ghost story to spook the superstitious. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real. The skid marks on the road, the empty seats illuminated by flickering lights. It was all too vivid to be a product of my imagination. Weeks turned into months, and I began to convince myself that it had been a one-time encounter, a strange but explainable incident. Until the next Christmas, I was careful to avoid Cambridge Gardens that year, taking a longer route home even if it meant braving the biting cold. But fate had other plans. A last-minute errand brought me back to that cursed stretch of road late on Christmas Eve. The fog was thicker than I had ever seen it, so dense that the gas lamps barely cast any light. As I walked, a familiar sound reached my ears, the low rumble of an engine, growing louder with each passing second. My blood turned to ice. I knew what was coming before I even saw it. The headlights pierced the fog, and there it was again, the same bus, moving impossibly fast, its interior a flickering void of empty seats. This time, I didn't wait to see if it would stop. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The roar of the engine seemed to follow me, growing louder and louder until it drowned out my thoughts. I could feel the heat of the headlights on my back, the vibration of the road beneath my feet. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, the sound stopped. I turned, gasping for breath. But the street behind me was empty. The bus was gone. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation, but nothing fits. The ghost bus of Cambridge Gardens remains a mystery, one that I pray I never encounter again. Every Christmas, I avoid that stretch of road, no matter how inconvenient, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint hum of an engine in the distance, and I wonder if it's still out there, searching for someone foolish enough to wave it down. And I hope to God it isn't me.